Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to the second interview on Finding Me, today with my very special guest, Ndumiso Dladla, a philosophy lecturer at the University of South Africa. In the first interview, we set the groundwork for understanding race and racism in South Africa, and Ndu was very, very careful to re-articulate over and over again so that nobody's under any misconceptions that you cannot understand racism without linking it to white supremacy. And that discussion, of course, took us into the various geographical spaces and to what is happening recently in the universities and in terms of xenophobia. And today we're going to take it just a little bit further in terms of the liberal discourse, in terms of the gentrification of the cities, and then finally to the global scale, where I want to touch on this whole idea of race, racism and Islamophobia related recently to the Charlie Hebdo killings. So with that, thank you again, Ndu, for making the time and for sharing your ideas with me.
It's a pleasure.
Okay, so let's take this discussion a little further. We stopped on your understanding or your expression or your opinion about xenophobia, and you said South Africans are actually white supremacists. So we have these cities, we have these locations which are separate. The locations, the townships for the black body, which perpetuates everything that has been generated for 300 years of the inferior status of the black person. But now we're seeing it in terms of the urban divide as well. Further 20 years into this so-called transition and this democracy, we're continuing this process of a spatial divide, of the apartheid of spaces. How do you understand it? For example, if you look at Burgess Park, which is in town, people are still afraid to go into Pretoria town. Oh, there's too many blacks, there's too much crime. Johannesburg city centre, the same. Too many black people, too much of crime. You move out the shopping areas into all these malls in the urban, into the more white areas, etc. You create malls, you create spaces where people can go, taking them away from where the actual population is. So how do you understand that in terms of the race and racism discussion?
Well, what we have to understand is, if we were to draw a diagram, if we were to draw a vertical diagram of how white supremacy would appear, even, what in philosophical terms we would call a hierarchy of being, an ontological hierarchy. In terms of apartheid's hierarchy, what you had was white people at the top, then you had Indian people, so-called colored people, and then the African population at the very bottom. Now, even the way in which spaces were actually determined, you would have the white suburban areas, which would then be surrounded by the Indian and colored areas, and then you would have the blacks. And there's various modes of logic for justifying this, but as you move in these concentric circles, you move away from what, in Fanonian terms, they would call a zone of life, where there are parks, clean air, and people can walk safely, to areas of increasing chaos and precarity. As you move outside from the center, you move into much greater degrees of danger, where people don't have sufficient resources, much greater degrees of violence. So some of the things that happen in the post-colonial moment is a complication of these geographies. So for instance, the urban areas now, where the workers, who are mostly black people because of their historical conditions in South Africa, will occupy the urban areas. White people then moved out into suburban areas. Of course, the affluent blacks, very much like in these racist incidents at the Curio school, where it was said that children were racially segregated, the black middle class and upper classes then chase after the white populations, because in a white supremacist symbological order, whiteness itself signifies life. It means it's safe. The police don't shoot you there. The service is good there. Things are generally much more pleasant. If there are more white people, it means that we are all safe, even from the black police, who are supposed to protect these white people. So what happened then is that these urban areas are then filled by these black workers. But what were happening, a phenomenon they call gentrification. You have, yuppies, right, which I think was originally meant young urban professionals, right? You have yuppies, mostly white people of considerable means, moving into these areas. It's almost a fetishization of this kind of death, of wanting the authentic experience of seeing poverty. You see this even express itself in interior decor. There's the rise of using these sort of tin cups and corrugated iron interior. You see this kind of fetish of wanting to have a closer proximity to the zone of death, which is created by our own largesse and consumption without being there. So it's highly securitized. There's lots of security to protect these white people then from the very black people they've injected themselves into the zone of, And then, of course, these black people can no longer afford properties in that place and have to start moving out of the inner city. This started in New York. It's said that a lot of white yuppies in New York have moved back to black neighborhoods like Harlem, where they've bought up properties, and black people are now thrown out of those areas which they can no longer afford to live in. So now you have basically the first world, which in geographical terms was the suburb in South Africa, where you have the first world returning to the third world to carve out a piece where it can stay very close, much like a zoo, and see these people there, but without interacting with them, from away from the safety of this thing. So I can't explain it exactly, but it seems to be something which is going on more and more.
Okay, considering now we've touched this, and I mean, the way you've explained it, it's actually mind-boggling to see that it is really happening, and yet then people claim, oh, there's no racism. There's the issue of diversity. We're in a diverse society. The reason we're there is because we embrace diversity. What is your response to that?
Well, the question of diversity is one which is interesting and takes us to the history of South African politics. Some traditions which identify themselves as part of the liberation tradition, although others would differ with whether we can actually characterize this as the liberation tradition, fall into what we would call a diversity school. What happened was that black people were not allowed to vote and were excluded from the franchise in the Cape Colony. And, the liberals came with this idea that if you have these special blacks with a certain amount of education who own some property, surely they should be allowed to exercise some kind of vote. And of course, what you have, post-94 is exactly the realization of the diversity model. So you and I are allowed to be in this space, which is a formally and really even now a predominantly white space, because we have certain amount of means and certain kind of language. But the rest of the brothers, of course, are guarding our cars and cooking the food in the kitchen. But because we are allowed to be in this space, in fact, that's precisely what the case is. We are allowed to be in this space. They can celebrate under the guise of diversity that things have changed in South Africa, because we would not have been allowed. Biko does in fact prophesize this and suggest that apartheid can actually maintain itself if it would only allow a small percentage of black people to join the ruling class. They would be able to use this ruling class to keep the rest of black people subjugated under the idea that the system is somehow changing while maintaining everything as is. And in fact, it seems this prophecy has found realization in South Africa today.
So while we're sitting here at the park and talking about it, early on you gave me two metaphors that both Biko and Sobukwe spoke about in this concept of being allowed, but it shouldn't be. Can you just elaborate on that for the benefit of the viewers?
All right. If one were to understand the question of liberation in philosophical terms, the point in South Africa is that the indigenous people were conquered and dispossessed of their land and then moved into this zone, this geography of death which we speak of. They were moved from places where plants grew well, where life was good, into labor reserves so that white people could occupy those good places. Now, the idea of the discourse of being allowed is that some of us will be allowed to come back into this space. This is a fundamentally unjust method of representing what is at odds. Now, Sobukwe speaks about the problem using the metaphor of a tree, insisting that, in fact, what we have is an African tree that belongs to us, the indigenous peoples conquered in the unjust wars of colonization. That this is our tree, and in fact, ideally, what should happen if we speak of liberation is that once we are sitting in our tree, people who want to enjoy its shade can join us on these terms, that this is in fact an African tree. In Biko, later on, following Sobukwe, of course, the tree has now been chopped and become a table. And Biko says, whereas the liberals would present the problem of liberation in terms in which blacks are now allowed to sit at the table with their master and dine with him, it is our table. Their master has no place being a master inviting people onto this table. Liberation would require that we take the table back and arrange it in an African fashion, making the point that it's our table to arrange as we would like to arrange. And at that point in time, when we've restored our relationship with the table, to invite those who will eat on the table, understanding the terms that this is our table, will return to the table. Of course, this is a situation which is very different from South Africa today.
Okay, well, we have to go to a break. When we come back, we're going to take it further. Thank you. We'll see you after the break. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to the final segment of the second interview with Ndumiso Dladla. Today we're talking about race and racism. And Ndu, before we went into the break, you spoke about this metaphor of the table, that it is our table and we can decide who to invite to that table, and it not should be that we should be invited to participate at the table. So considering the EFF and considering the ANC, there's obviously a struggle here in terms of understanding that the ANC has been invited to the table. The EFF is saying, no, the table is ours. We will decide. We want to set the ground rules. How do you make this distinguish, or how do you distinguish this political ideology between the two parties?
All right. In simple terms, I guess that I would say that the ANC tradition is really an expression of the old liberal tradition of petitioning to the master at the table, saying, Master, I am Christian like you, I speak English like you, I have some property, let me sit on the table with you, surely we are the same. It's to accept the terms which are set by the conqueror for how the conquered should live its life. The alternative tradition, which has a long history also in South Africa, even before the formation of the ANC, in the struggles of our honored kings, Shaka Zulu, Hintsa, even the Bambata Revolution a few years before the start of the ANC, insisted on the restoration of sovereignty, insisting that this is our land. And, we shall not pay taxes to anyone. We shall not be allowed to live here. It is our land. So here we have that friction arising again under the guise of compensation for the land. So if one is to pay back for land, which we say has been dispossessed according to immoral and unlawful means, to pay back is to legitimize the racist thesis that black people had no right to be present, that they could not have owned the land. To pay back is to say that the occupation of South Africa, which is what has been happening for the last 350 years, is legitimate. And because we recognize its legitimacy, we'll transfer value in order to get this land back. But if one insists that We were conquered unjustly, and this is in fact our land. No such negotiation should take place. What simply needs to be given is the land back to its people, who shall decide then the terms in which it shall be used, even for the posterity of those who acquired it unlawfully and unjustly. So this is the contention. One is a truthful one, which says we have been human beings since time immemorial and were dispossessed and want what is ours back. This is liberation. And the other says we will negotiate with terrorists, we will negotiate with dispossessors who have unlawfully acquired this, but pay them for this unlawful occupation.
So the EFF basically is refusing to negotiate. The ANC has said, no, we're a diverse society. We have to accept that there's no racism anymore, that everybody is equal. But the narrative in Parliament, the narrative in the media, the narrative in wider society that is still being perpetuated is that the EFF is barbaric, it's violent, it is going to bring South Africa into chaos, it's going to bring economic principles that's going to ruin this country. I mean, if you consider the two narratives, how do you as an African respond to these claims?
It returns us back to the question that the occupation and dispossession of the land happened on the grounds that the African was not a human being equal to others. It happened on the doubt of the humanity of the African. Now, if you are in doubt concerning this humanity, then you must admit that there must be some payment and negotiation which is done. If you hold that the African is a human being and there was no business except injustice in doubting the humanity of the African, then the land must be returned immediately. So the perpetuation of the discourse of justice and its equation with barbarism, with violence, for those insisting on what is rightfully theirs, is really, again, the perpetuation of white supremacy through a legitimization of the present order, which of course has been normalized because it's been so abnormal for such a long time. But in fact, insisting on the restoration of sovereignty is in fact insisting on the restoration of normality, of a just and ethical system of governance to begin from the start. So the conservatives of the present order will represent the call for justice as barbaric, but really it is nothing less than the truth,
Okay, now you've spoken about this whole notion again of perpetuating the idea of the lesser human being, of the inferior, of the black body not having any civilization or any humanity. And we see the same narrative being perpetuated against Muslims and against the religion of Islam per se. And I suppose in many ways this abuse and also the theft of Muslim lands, theft of Muslim resources, the destruction of the Muslim body, the Muslim epistemicide of Islam and Islamic culture, Islamic values, Islamic societies, the drones, the random killing of civilians, etc., has generated a second dialogue and has translated in the recent killings of what we see in what happened in France and Charlie Hebdo. How do you understand this dialogue? Is this behavior also inferiorizing or infantilizing or a nullifying of a people because they are the other?
Well, it's exactly as you have put it. It's exactly this alterity now playing itself out at a global stage. Of course, we do realize that the third world and all those places which were not inhabited by Europeans became the township of the world, if we use this concept of the geography of death. So all of the pollution, all of that which was undesirable within the West was exported to these occupations, to these territories which were occupied, which the various peoples of were conquered. Now, precisely in their insistence on their humanity, which is second to none, what their struggles for freedom are then represented as this kind of barbarism. Their insistence on a discourse of freedom is represented as barbarism. And if you want to see the hypocrisy of this, you will remember that during the Charlie Hebdo situation, even our own local newspapers were running with this Je suis Charlie. The Mail and Guardian, quite disgustingly on that Friday, led with this headline. What is curious for us to see is that during Marikana, there was no Je suis Marikana. Even during the Ferguson killings in America, the Mail and Guardian didn't say Je suis noir, you know.
Or that Black Lives Matter.
Right. So it's precisely playing into this idea of differentiated values of life. You know, the Boko Haram attacks in Nigeria, they didn't so much as arouse a headline in the first part of the paper. So it is exactly playing into this idea of which lives matter and which lives do not, you know, which plays itself out. Our South African situation is really the manifestation of a local problem, of something which maintains its tentacles at a global scale continually, you know, and all that which is not assimilated into the Western order of things is then treated as inferior, as inhuman, you know, as black, as worthy of death, and placed in places and situations in which it's to be killed, to be exterminated, to be silenced, out of the curriculum at the university, out of the history textbook, out of the media, you know. So it's to be silenced, to be dealt with like a cockroach, basically.
Okay, we're at the end of the interview basically, and I want you to wrap up for me with your final thoughts on how you link this global escalation, what I describe as Islamophobia, linked to racism and the issues at current level.
It's really quite a big question that you're asking, and I think we need to realize that the complex of structures which are operating, even the South African negotiations, were not without the hands of international capital. Of course, we know that some of the advanced steps which colonialism took here were really tied to international capital after the discovery of diamonds and then gold in South Africa. So the situations which we find in the third world, in fact, even to treat them as local situations is to make a mistake. What we really have here is a world order, you know, and it's very difficult to see how to think liberation without the changing of the entire world. It would seem it would be impossible even for us in South Africa to attain liberation without the entire world itself changing. And how this is to be done, I don't know, but I think it begins in the kinds of questions which the EFF begins to ask in Parliament, and in insisting on asking those kinds of questions and not being afraid to be called barbarians by speaking the truth whenever it does present itself, that the present situation is unjust and it will not be made just simply by our silence. We must speak about it.
Thank you very much. And I think what's important for me in your final comment is that it's always important to speak the truth, because a situation of injustice is always untenable. So with that, thank you very much for sharing your ideas and for always educating me. With that, fi amanillah, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.